They sabotaged my C-17 in midair, so I shut down the engines and prepared for the manual crash. The words left my mouth before my brain had a chance to dress them up. They felt wrong there, too blunt for the soft clatter of instruments and the human sounds around me, but they were true, and they landed like a bullet anyway. Lights stuttered. An alarm I didn't recognize rose and fell like a thin animal. Garcia, our loadmaster, was already up out of his jump seat, a silhouette in the doorway, with a flashlight bobbing against the cabin like a blind lighthouse. Litted Owens, my co-pilot, had both hands on the yoke and his jaw working under a face I knew too well from a dozen routine flights. It was the kind of tightness that said he was trying to buy time with motion. Somewhere down the fuselage, a child's whimper threaded through the chaos. There were stretchers and crates, and a pallet marked with the kind of stickers that made commanders frown and medics pray. 2 nurses had their elbows locked around a patient's head, as if the fuselage might toss it away. I glimpsed a young boy, no more than 10, his face pressed to the plastic of a window, eyes enormous and focused on the sky like he could see the danger coming and stop it. Smoke didn't pour in. It leaked, thin, suspicious, the smell of warm plastic and electrical singe that made my teeth ache. An instrument in the corner blinked orange, then black. A readout flashed nonsense for a heartbeat and went quiet as a dismissed sergeant. Systems disagreed with each other the way soldiers under stress lie through clenched teeth. Their stories didn't match. "Something's wrong," Owen said. It wasn't a question. I could have said that this was a failure of components, an electrical gremlin, bad wiring, atmosphere interference, any of the safe things we say to pad the truth. I didn't. My training didn't let me guess. It made me look. It made me look hard and listen for the shape of danger hidden in accidents. There are moments when you transition from routine into something else. You cross a line so quiet you only notice it afterward. For me, it always started with counting. Not numbers in a spreadsheet, the kind you use with a flashlight in a dark doorway. 1, 2, 3. You measure seconds like medicines. You count to keep the mind from being stolen by panic. You count to test hypotheses. Is this noise a problem or a precursor? Is that smell a hint of smoke or something worse? I counted. I counted the inconsistencies, the way a hydraulic indicator jittered without load, the way the flight controls lagged then snapped like a tired muscle refusing and then obeying, the way the avionics bay temperature rose a breath quicker than it should have. These weren't failures that lined up, they were a pattern with an author. "This wasn't an accident," I said. My voice was flat. The cabin's hubbub shifted. It was the sound of people listening to a statement about them and not wanting to believe it. Garcia swore under his breath and pointed his light forward, into the dark belly where wires lived and metal met metal. He sounded like a man who'd spent nights crawling under vehicles and knew the smell of a bad capacitor. "Avionics," he called. "There's smoke, up forward." "Medical?" one of the nurses yelled. "Do we move them? Are we going to—" "Hold," I said. Not a command so much as a script line that let everyone stop talking for half a breath. Decisions come faster when you quiet the room. They come cleaner. I have a file of memories that look like combat snapshots. Not cinematic, not noble, gritty, compressed images that live at the corners of my mind. A hand on a rifle, sand that tasted like metal. The compressed dark of an Afghan compound where the only light came from muzzle flashes, and the peripheral glow of another man's fear. Clearing a doorway by yourself because your partner's heartbeat told you to. The weight of knowing whether to shoot or not, delivered in less than a second. The training that forced me to string instinct into action until it was a kind of machine inside me, a thing that could be turned on when everything else was failing. I call it the Ranger switch. It isn't a mystical thing. It's habit shoved into emergency mode. You stop being a person with a family and a mortgage and voice messages. You become a set of conditioned responses that map to survival. It kicks in when you don't have time to be scared. It makes your hands steady and your vision tunnel only enough to see what matters. It clicked now. "Listen to me," I said. "This is deliberate." There was a silence that had nothing to do with the alarms. It was the way a classroom goes quiet when a teacher means to be heard. It was the way crews listen to captains, because failing to listen is how people die. "No accident," Owens countered, the word clinging to him like a life preserver. He'd flown with me for 2 years. He trusted procedure. He trusted my hands. He trusted me the way men trust the bridge of a ship when surf breaks against the hull. But his hands shook on the yoke, small tremors in the fingers. I saw them like tiny flags. I flung the problem forward in the simplest terms I had: people, cargo, time. There were stretchers and a pallet with something that shouldn't be in an unsecured freight hold during turbulence, fragile, volatile. There were civilians. There were routes below that could mean a city. There was the radio buzzing like a distant insect. Above all, there was suspicion, deliberate action that could lead to a catastrophic failure in flight. We argued like shipmates over a course. Each voice was a compass needle pointing toward the safest shore they could see. Owens wanted to keep things online. He wanted to reason with the machine, to diagnose and isolate, to patch in ways his hands knew. Garcia wanted us to get down now, to dump weight and lighten the load. He wanted fire trucks, not theories. The nurses wanted to know if the patients would survive an unexpected descent. The boy's mother mouthed a prayer that saw the plane as a cage with wings. None of their compasses pointed the way I saw. I made a decision in a second. It was not brash. It was not a gamble to posture on bravery. It was a transaction, my body for their lives. I shut off things because I believed that taking away power from a compromised heart was the only way to prevent a worse explosion. I did it because in my gut, continuing to feed a machine we did not control was like handing more fuel to a fire you couldn't find. I announced it flatly. "I'm shutting the engines," I said. The words went over the intercom, and in the cockpit they translated to an act that would change everything. Owen's eyes flicked to mine, like a man reading a map he hadn't been offered before. He looked terrified, yes, but also relieved. Relief in aviation has a peculiar look, like a soldier exhaling at the sight of a friendly truck. There was no technical detail. There was no lever-by-lever explanation. There was only the intention I handed him: remove power, stop feeding whatever was dying in the systems, reduce the chances of an uncontrolled event. That was what I could do without turning the cockpit into a how-to manual for disaster. The engines answered differently than they had a minute ago. They went from the steady, reassuring hum that felt like a mechanical heartbeat to a fading pulse. The plane shuddered, like a beast that settles when its head is no longer prodded. The sound in the cockpit changed. The low, constant vibration of machinery softened, replaced by the rush of air and the new, higher-pitched banshee of warning flags. We lost thrust. The aircraft leaned into itself as if deciding how to be without force. It became heavier in the way a body feels when it's trying to remember how to breathe after being underwater. The attitude changed. The nose pitched and the wings sought a new balance. The noise of the world amplified. The wind ran along the fuselage and through the open vents like a wild thing seeking an exit. Alarms screamed like birds. The avionics bay beneath us sighed out heat and stuttered sparks that painted the ceiling with orange freckles. Smoke hairlined the cabin more insistently, and someone started coughing behind me, loud enough that it became a chorus. The child that had been staring at the sky found my hand drifting toward him and clutched it tight enough to bruise. I did not know his name. In that instant, I knew I would die for him. Garcia was a machine in motion. He moved through the cabin with a surgeon's efficiency, shouting to the nurses, corralling bodies into positions that made sense within the chaos. He used straps, blankets, kit bags, anything with enough bulk to be a crutch in a plane that was trying to forget how to fly. He didn't have the whisper of a plan that would make sense to an outsider. He had improvisation and muscle memory. He slid a patient into a more sheltered bay, and then, because there were no proper tools, he wedged a freight strap under the pallet and looped it around a knee like a tourniquet of luck. "Bring them toward the center line," he barked. "Keep them down. Lower heads. Hold." Words like that are useless without the hands that obey them. Hands pulled straps tight. Knees were planted like stakes. The nurses became anchors, their arms proud and running with adrenaline and professional tenderness. They did medicine with what they had, cutting away clothing, placing pressure with fingers, holding airway with the kind of focus you learn when you see a life flicker like a candle and refuse to let it go. I moved to the flight deck and took the other captain's seat. My back hit the foam, and the old familiar calm spread out like a map. I don't know why calm visits like that. It isn't the absence of fear. It's a reallocation of it. Fear becomes data. Fear becomes the fuel for action. "The approach will be manual," I said to Owens. "Prepare to fly without the systems. All of you, get ready to brace." His answer was a nod that looked like a small private surrender. I could have explained reasons. I could have given them technical qualifiers, probabilities, the kind of language that makes lawyers sleep better. I didn't. In a crisis, reason is a weapon you can't afford to waste on words. The cabin heaved. Things shifted and the sound of the world outside surged. The plane was a broad, slow animal now, gliding with a mass that wanted to keep going. The steadiest thing in that moving house was the human decision to move not into panic, but into work. People found roles like survivors do, clinging, fixing, pulling. The mother pulled the boy's face into her chest, the nurses intoned measurements like prayers, the cadence of dosage and compression. Owens's hands were steady again. Training is a stubborn thing. We had minutes, maybe fewer. Time distorts in these situations. Seconds stretch like elastic. I remembered a night on a rooftop in Kandahar, where a kid's scream had torn the dark open. I remembered the medic's hands steady on an artery. I remembered thinking then, and I think now, that choices are what make people out of soldiers. The choice to act or not is a moral template. This is where the moral calculus shows its face. I was not acting bravely because the world would applaud me. I was acting because the alternative, a powered aircraft with compromised systems, a ticking unknown among fused wires and strapped explosives, felt unconscionable. Keep the engines and you might keep flight, yes. You might also feed a heart that had been poisoned. Stop the engines and the plane becomes a glider. Slower, less responsive, but it might keep an explosion from finding the theater of its fury. You can wring hands about what I did. You can call it reckless or heroic. I call it a decision I made because I had the ability to make it. Command is the ingestion of consequence. You choose, and then you wear what your choice becomes. The descent was not cinematic. It was a series of tiny fights against physics and pessimism. Wind hammered the fuselage, tugging at loose screws and the worn seals around windows. The plane hissed as vents that were designed for controlled pressures found abrupt new work. A pallet strap sheared with a sound like a gunshot, and a crate shifted with it, and something in it cracked open. Small things, but in the cabin every small thing is a potential wide placard of danger. Someone screamed. A woman by the rear door shouted a word that might have been a name. The boy's hand left mine for a second to reach for air, and I found myself correcting his grip like a reflex. I felt like a surgeon suturing panic with my fingers. I told jokes no one heard, and everyone heard. I told a nurse she smelled of coffee, and that the patient under her hands had an elbow that liked to curl up in triumph. Human nonsense in the middle of catastrophe keeps people tethered to humanity. I took inventory with my eyes. The cargo pallets in front of us had the labels of urgency: fragile, medical, priority. There was a container with a painted emblem I recognized as a research crate, sensitive, but the details didn't matter because in the end everything on that pallet was just more weight and another variable. One of the pallets was warm to the touch where a sensor had been wronged. Warm meant a reaction was beginning. Warm meant heat. Heat meant expansion. Expansion meant pressure. The chain of possible outcomes is long, and human life sits at the bottom of it, like something to be protected or sacrificed. Garcia worked in the aisle with the blunt, useful language of a man who spent nights wrangling freight in mud. He used straps and hooks with an economy of movement that came from muscle memory. He didn't consult a manual. He didn't need to. He had hands and will and a brain that made itself useful. "We're losing electricals," he said once, which meant little and meant everything. The phrase could have been technical, but I heard it as a rumor of doom. The lights in the cabin dimmed and brightened like a pulse. The overhead chime that had once been steady and predictable now sounded off-key. It was not the sound of a machine breaking down. It was the sound of a machine with a story told by someone else. I moved through the cabin to check faces. People look different when they expect to die. Their features sharpen as if made by a punch of light. Eyes harden, lips part for last words or prayers. I saw faces I didn't know and loved them in that instant because they were human and fragile, and I had a duty to them. A woman pressed a photograph into my hand. Two people in fatigues, smiling like they had been lied to by a good day. "It's my husband," she said. "He flew with me once, said you'd be good to have." I folded the picture into my palm like a talisman. It was ridiculous and ordinary, and I kept it anyway. We were cutting through the sky like a wounded thing. The idea of landing anywhere soft and controlled narrowed into a single arithmetic, somewhere with space, fewer people below, and rescue nearby. The world under us was a patchwork I could barely read, fields and towns breaking into a grid that meant shelter or catastrophe, depending where the plane chose to rest. There were power lines, roads, a thin strip of river, a mirror for the sky. I couldn't take a moment to decide ethically whether to aim for a field and risk the lives of people on the ground, or to keep over open water and risk our own patience. Those are the impossible questions. My training gave me the posture for them, but not the moral absolution. "Where's the safest place?" Owens asked. The question was not for me to answer out loud. It was for my head to solve while the world around us dissolved into tasks. I thought of the field near the base, a flat place where cranes waited, where rescue teams could work. I thought of neighborhoods with kids playing after school. I thought of what people look like when they are surprised by dying things. I thought of the weight of a child's hand in mine and the sound of our engines when they were whole. Decisions in flight are not philosophical musings. They are transactions with time. They come with a price tag. You spend something, speed, altitude, safety, and get something back. Distance, survivability, chance. You bargain with physics using what you have, body, mind, crew, and the will to keep moving toward option. We briefed the cabin in the language of simple, direct verbs. Get low, keep still, hold the straps. Do not look out the windows for spectacle. The nurses nodded and took command of the triage area. People obeyed because order in chaos has a safety unto itself. Fire took the avionics bay like a rumor becoming a fact. It didn't explode into flame. It was more like a room discovering its disappointment. Smoke thickened, and the taste of it filled my mouth with copper. I tasted fear as a metallic stain. I tasted the place in me where I had been a ranger and a medic and a commander and a daughter. Flashbacks come in odd places. Between the circuit of breathing and the fall of the plane, my mind took me back to a midnight patrol where a fellow soldier bled thinly from a hidden wound. We had no field hospital. We had a knife and a prayer, and a decision to fashion a tourniquet of belt and adrenaline. We made a cradle and dragged him to safety through the sand. He survived for reasons that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with people making themselves useful. That memory is a tool in my pocket now, a lens I used to look at problems. The boy's hand in mine was small enough to anchor me. He squeezed and his knuckles went white and then purple. He didn't say my name. He didn't speak English all that well. He spoke in the language of a child who knew his mother's hand was his compass. He was the kind of person I had trained to protect, framed differently now by context, but the same in value. I felt a fierce tenderness for him, the kind that can be dangerous in a commander because it makes you take risks you might otherwise avoid. We had a plan because planning was what we did. It was not a technical plan with settings and knobs. It was a human plan. Get the aircraft to a place where rescue could reach us, keep the most vulnerable toward the center, stop feeding whatever was killing the bird, and hold the people together until the ground met the fuselage. I told Owens to index his inputs on feel, not on the instruments that were lying to him. That meant trusting raw hands to the air. He breathed out slow and pushed the yoke the way a man who had once learned to steer a canoe through rapids would, by reading water with his bones. The plane obeyed like a reluctant old friend. The descent lengthened like a corridor with no doors. It felt obscene to think of the people below as terrain in a game. They were families and workers and dogs stealing a slice of sun. I thought of the mother who had given me a photograph and felt the absurdity of private treasures and public duty folded into the same palm. Sparks in the avionics bay crawled too quickly for comfort, and the floor hummed where the pallet had shifted. Garcia's flashlight found a smear of something dark and sticky, and the smell told him what he needed to know without words. He swore again, a short, hard sound. "We have something heating," he said. "Our job is containment," I replied. The sentence was a policy statement and a prayer. We did what we could without instructions. We rapped, we moved, we used soft things to smother sparks, covering them with coats and blankets until we had the illusion of control. We jammed a strap into a rut to hold a door closed. I held the child's hand so the boy's lungs could follow my cadence. I felt the pilot's life in the man next to me and watched his pupils dilate and contract until he found a rhythm to match the sky. Somewhere in the radio static came snippets of voice, ground control asking questions I couldn't answer, other aircraft in the distance sounding like the guardians they'd always been for us. The world was organizing into helpers as best as it could. I could feel rescue thinking of us the way a doctor thinks of a patient, triage at scale. We were part of a larger organism now, and our choices fed into that bigger good. I thought about being invisible. For a long time after I left the Rangers, people treated me like I was a ghost, useful in the dark but awkward in daylight. That invisibility is a strange armor. No one expects much of a shadow. They don't ask hard questions of you, and you can move without applause. But invisibility is also a theft. It takes away recognition when recognition would protect you, give you authority, and make others listen before they act. On this day, invisibility could have killed us, but being noticed would have brought intervention sooner than we could create on our own. I told myself I didn't want notice. I wanted ordinariness. I wanted to come home and fix a leaky sink and not be on billboards. I wanted to be the kind of person who could be left alone in the dark. But the world does not owe us that. When a thing calls for someone to stand in the breach, it chooses. And we answer whether we like it or not. A patch of cleared ground came into view like a promise, halfway between prayer and mechanics. It was a strip without power lines, and with the kind of flatness pilots covet in desperate times. It was far. It was not ideal, but it had a merciful lack of houses. It had, best of all, the possibility of rescue vehicles crossing at speed. "That's our field," Owen said. He spoke it like a benediction. The phrase landed and took root. Everyone listened now in a new way. The cabin tightened. Breath fell into a shared rhythm. The nurses doubled down on the patients. Garcia breathed out a sound like a man who'd seen a lifeline and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I made one more decision. Where else to put the plane would be secondary to getting people ready to meet whatever ground we could find. We would prepare the cabin for impact. That meant positions and protection and the blunt work of human strength. It meant making the plane a vessel of human will rather than a victim of cold machinery. I moved down the aisle and braced myself in the doorway. The plane rolled gently, as if trying to find a pillow. The sky outside had narrowed into a band of turbulence and green fields stitched with roads. The wind made the fuselage sing, a thin constant that sounded like a distant factory. People murmured prayers and recited the names of loved ones like a litany. Garcia handed me a strap, thick and stained, which I took without question. We weren't doing choreography. We were improvising a liturgy. We made knots with gloves on hands that had once tied off boots and never imagined they'd tie human safety into place. The child wrapped his small fingers around that strap like a sacrament. I anchored my hand at his wrist and told him not to worry about the alarms. I lied. I said it the way you tell a child the ocean will be kind, because fear can make less of a thing into more. We were minutes out. I could see the field growing under the nose like the slow opening of a book. The descent steepened a fraction, like a person leaning forward to read a sentence. My hands were steady because they had to be steady. There was a promise I had made once, to the unit, to myself, that when the world needed a choice made in a moment, I would be the one to make it. I hadn't thought then that the choice might be to turn off the engines of the bird I commanded. My fingers found their hold, and I felt something like regret pulse through me, not for the decision itself, but for the fact that the world keeps handing people impossible equations. Regret edges heroism with a human shape. It makes the stories we tell afterward more honest. It makes the photographs look like people rather than angels. I spoke into the intercom for the last time before we met the ground in earnest. "Brace," I said. Simple. Not a plea. Not a sermon. Just a word that asks bodies to gather courage and hold it. Someone behind me sobbed a single, sharp sound that felt like a released animal. The boy squeezed my hand so hard that I tasted metal. Owens checked his instruments, not because they were reliable anymore, but because habits die slow. Garcia's voice steadied and projected like a man used to calming animals. The nurses whispered prayers and rubbed palms until the patients calmed enough to breathe. We crossed the final invisible threshold, where decisions became consequences. The field below was close enough to see individual trees, and the faint strip of a road cut like a vein across a patchwork of green. Rescue would come. Whether it would come in time was a speculation for the future. For now, all we had was each other, and the landing we would build from nothing but will. I leaned forward and braced my shoulder against the support. The plane's skin whined under a stress it was not designed to bear in this way. My knuckles whitened on the strap, but I didn't feel them as much as I felt the boy's pulse under my fingers. He was a tether. I thought of the photograph a mother had handed me, and the soldier with a grin. I thought of nights on the rooftop where the sky was a thin thing and people hid in the folds of each other's bravery. There are thousands of stories that live in a captain's chest. Most of them never get told. They are mundane collections of landing lights and coffee, of late-night chats about children, of private habits. They include the small moments nobody photographs, a hand on a shoulder, a joke to cut the edge of fear, a silent promise that you won't let go. We were about to learn how many of those promises would hold. The plane dipped like a tired animal, and the field rushed up to meet us, a green tongue stretched toward strangers. I could see the line where earth ended and gravel began. Trees leaned away as if they themselves were holding breath. In the cockpit, my world narrowed into point-of-focus details. The child's knuckles, Owen's face, the flight controls under my palms that demanded weight and attention, but would not teach me secrets. I thought again of the Ranger switch, how it had clicked on in me that morning, and how it guided rough hands into delicate work. I thought of being seen for the first time as a person who can make choices that are moral and violent and necessary all at once. We were not beyond risk. The air smelled of heated cables and breath. The skin of the plane creaked as metal remembered its limits. People behind me murmured, and the thrum of expectation, fear clothed as hope, filled the cabin. The strip under us was getting closer, and with it the angle of final choices, speed or control, center line or open meadow, the calculus that determines whether the next chapter has the words survived or did not. I anchored myself in the present as a meditation. I thought of the soldiers and medics that had taught me the economy of motion. I thought of the boy who didn't know my name but trusted me enough to hold my hand. I thought of my own mother, who had once told me to always bring someone home if you could. I'd brought their faces with me into the cockpit as compass points. We crossed the last ridge of clouds, and the wind struck the fuselage in a way that felt like an accusation. I tightened my hand on the strap and spoke into the radio, words meant for people who were already moving. Prepare the ground, prepare rescue, brace positions 2 through 5, hold for impact. Those words were not technical steps. They were a roll call of human intent. They were small torches lit in the dark. Then the world contracted. The nose dipped, the belly feathered like a bird learning a terrible lesson. The landing gear would not be a thing we could count on, but we treated it like an idea, hopeful and simple. The earth punched up at us, and I felt an old, familiar surge of adrenaline. It is a chemical that is the same in medics and soldiers and anyone who has ever jumped. I thought of the people below, strangers with lawns and dogs, and felt a sharp sorrow that the world asked people to become pawns in others' wars. I thought of the men and women who had made a choice to sabotage us, whoever they were. They would not be in my reckoning that day. Accountability is a quiet door that opens later. For now, we welded ourselves to survival. In the last seconds before contact, no one spoke the words heroes or angels or reckless. We were just a plane and its cargo trying to be kind to the law of gravity. I held on. The boy's hand locked around mine. Garcia's voice was steady. Owen's was as concentrated as a chess player in the last move. And then the field came up to meet us. The field came up to meet us. The impact was not a single glorious moment. It was a series of small betrayals. The nose struck first with a sound like iron folding. The fuselage shuddered and then met earth in a grinding, hungry way, metal curving where it shouldn't, crates tumbling as if possessed. The world turned into a hard, moving wall that flattened and then rolled away. For a heartbeat, the cabin was a drum of noise. Moans, the ripping of fabric, the metallic sob of stressed struts. The child's cry gone thin and then steadier as breath found its rhythm again. We rolled. Things flew. The lights popped and went to a dozen shades of dying. The floor tilted and someone hit the ceiling for the briefest moment like a man on a dishonored spring, then slammed down again. I tasted copper. I tasted the acrid tang of burning insulation and the oil-sweet smell of scalded composites. My shoulder screamed with a brilliance that made me blink stars across my vision, but my hand was still clenched around the strap, and the boy's fingers still held mine, tight as if breaking that hold might break everything. Garcia's voice cut through the aftermath like a practiced saw. "Everybody, stay!" he shouted. It wasn't the gentle command of someone conducting an orderly evacuation. It was the kind of shout that organizes bodies by force. He had a flashlight in his teeth and moved like someone whose limbs had been trained to find the right motion, even when the world had stopped making sense. Owens staggered out of his seat, eyes wide, white at the rims. His jaw worked, but he wasn't shouting. The yoke tilting to one side had its own story of what had just happened. The world beyond the cockpit was a smear of green and dust. He touched my shoulder for a second, in a gesture I had seen before in foxholes and hospital tents, a quick, human benediction. We were both in pieces. That was the honest truth. But function always arrives ahead of full sensation. "Listen," I said. My voice could only be one thing in that moment, a steadying band. We braced to get people out, move slow, move purpose. People moved like animals learning a new language. Some were stunned, some were bleeding. The nurses snapped into motion, faces set like the edges of a knife. They moved with hands that knew how to keep a pulse alive. One of them, older, hair in a tight knot, looked at me with a clarity that felt like a report. Patience first. I don't remember the first hour in rational detail. Memory in those moments is a pocket of film frames blown together. I remember that the cargo door had separated and lay in the grass like a rent flag. I remember climbing down through an aperture that had never been meant as an exit, feeling the ground hit against my boots and the sweet, crude smell of crushed earth. I remember the boy pulling me down and then drooping against my chest, small and wet with tears and dust. We did a quick sweep, what medics call the primary survey, but I never thought to count out loud. People with obvious life threats were lifted and moved toward the open field edge where the rescuers could find them. Hands were everywhere. Military training is generous in that way. It teaches you to use your hands without asking for permission. Straps were cut, bandages improvised, coats folded into pads. There were no fanfares. There were only hands. Ambulances came like thunder later. Until then, it was the soldiers on the ground, the base security teams, the volunteer farmers from the nearest town who had seen smoke and come with pickup trucks and courage, and a medevac crew whose faces were shadows behind helmets. Helicopter rotors thumped the air into a pressure that made the hair at the back of my neck lie flat. I wanted to stand up straight and salute things that were not flags. I wanted to feel grateful and therefore small. The world felt larger than me in the way that a room feels large after a candle is blown out. We loaded those we could lift. We made stretchers from pallets and blanket rolls. Children were wrapped like treasures. The nurses moved with a fierce softness, hands that would not let go. There were a few who could not be moved, pinned by debris, unconscious, faces powdered with dust. We called to the medevac team and they moved as if the choreography had been written before the play began. Listening back, I know we were slow and quick in the way of any unplanned ballet. By the time I was helped into an ambulance, my left ribs informed me they might be broken. It was a simple, honest pain that translated into breath in a way that made every inhale a negotiation. My shoulder had a bruise the size of a palm. My face had a scratch that made a bright, hot line across my cheek. My hearing was the useless, echoey kind that comes after bangs. Voices sounded like people through cotton. In the emergency triage area, I found myself doing what I always did, assessing, delegating, smoothing. The ragged edges of my person faded under the banner of the job. Someone wrapped my wound in a way that meant to keep me going. A medic caught my hand and squeezed it in a way that meant, "You're not off duty yet." I said names, I read the labels on pallets to see what's important. I learned to make priorities out of people. Later, when the adrenaline thinned and pain filled the spaces that had been held by movement, there were other sounds. The low, legal breath of radios ordering investigations, the soft murmur of conspiracy, that human phenomenon that stitches fear into stories, the arrival of uniforms that carried with them the smell of formality. The official response was efficient and blunt. We were moved into the base medical tent and then to the hospital, where they took X-rays and papers and statements. There were interviews with officers who wore their grief in clinical lines on their faces, and there were investigators whose eyes had a different hunger. They wanted to know who, not just what. They asked for logs and cargoes and manifests. They asked for me by name, and with a kind of inscrutable tenderness, asked me to recount things I could barely see whole. I told them what mattered. Where people were seated, who was injured, which containers had heating. I told them about the smoke and the way the avionics had stuttered. I said enough to indicate sabotage without giving them an operative manual. Their eyes sharpened, their questions multiplied. They sabotaged my C-17 in mid-air. I told them again, though not as loud as in the cockpit. The phrase had become an unavoidable fact. The words landed differently in an office than they had over speakers. In the office, the words were grist, material to be winnowed. When the media found me, because they always find you when something is big and startling, they asked for sound bites. Their lens liked metaphors: hero, miracle, reckless. A reporter asked if I had been heroic. I tasted my scar and the metal in my mouth and thought of men and women inside the fuselage who had been brave without cameras. I told the reporter something about the crew and the nurses and the people who had held stretchers in their arms like affidavits. I said I had done what I thought I had to do. That answer was accurate but insufficient as a story. The public loves neat narratives, someone good who did something great in a short, clean arc. The real thing is messy. It has costs and small moral stains. The world circled on labels, and I learned quickly that being clear about the stakes did not inoculate you from the need for the world to simplify. There were fatalities. It is one of the hard, immovable truths. Even well-made decisions can lead to loss. A cargo technician had been pinned under a pallet and later died in the hospital. A passenger with severe burns did not make it. Names were read out in a room that smelled like coffee and disinfectant, and I found myself standing at the edge of grief for people whose names I might never know except now, carved onto lists. Surviving meant living with that arithmetic. It meant knowing some of the balance of the ledger could not be fixed by apologies. The investigation moved like a patient animal. They catalogued debris and read through black boxes and interviewed people like me in rooms that felt too wide. I answered the same questions many times. The repetition ground into me like a file. What did you see? When did you decide? Why did you do it? There were fingers pointed at logistics providers, at handlers, and at unknown hands behind curtain walls. One term kept returning in the investigators' mouths: deliberate. Deliberate implied intention, and intention suggested culprits. I carried the word like a stone. Weeks later, the official line, contradictory and slow to settle, was that we had been targeted. Somebody had altered things only they should have been able to touch. The word sabotage was used in memos with a coldness that made it more monstrous. Sinister acts. Shadowy actors. I read leaks and denials, and the way the press loved a villain so much, they sometimes invented one. There were hearings. There were questions about my choices. People argued in places designed for shouting, beneath the guise of parliamentary inquiry. It is an odd human certainty that the person who acts when others freeze will always be asked to explain their motives. Others demanded proof that turning off engines was not reckless. Others called for thank yous and medals. I found myself sitting across from men in suits who wanted a narrative that matched their beliefs. I answered in the same economy I always do: facts and an account of the moral calculus. I spoke of reducing immediate risk by taking away power from a compromised system. I spoke of a decision not to feed a failing heart. I spoke of trying to make a choice that weighed people equally, rather than letting randomness dice them. Some applauded. The press ran photographs of the crew with paint-streaked faces and hospital gowns and called us angels or reckless saviors. Social feeds filled with quick judgments, a minority who condemned, a majority who praised. There were op-eds that wanted a hero and a handful that wanted caution and reforms. There were thank you letters from the families of survivors and quiet private visits from colleagues who looked like they had walked through something and wanted to be sure you had too. I did accept a decoration eventually, not for myself, but as a symbol for the crew and the nurses who worked without cameras. The ceremony was a small theatre of formality. I shouldered the ribbon with a strange sense of dissonance. I had never wanted to be famous. I had wanted to be useful. Recognition felt like noise. It also felt like a necessary amplification. The work of those who choose to hold others up needed light, if only to make sure systems were changed and safety improved. There was a cost that no medal could fix. Sleep became a thin sheet you could see through to darker rooms. The sounds of the crash rewound in my head like a stuck film, sometimes in slow motion, with the tiny fractures becoming huge and hard, sometimes compressed into a single boomed impact that left a ringing in my teeth. I would be making coffee, and a creak would sound like an airframe in distress, and the hair on my arms would stand up. There were nights when I woke with a memory of a child's hand, pale and small, slipping from mine, in a dream I never fully escaped. Therapy was an instruction I took seriously. I had never shamed help in combat. We used to debrief and talk and keep each other honest. Now, the conversations were different. They had couches and words like processing and triggers. They had people with degrees and patience. They had me learning to name my fears without letting them write the script of my days. I went back to the air eventually. It is a dangerous confession, perhaps, and yet it is also the only honest one. The first flight back was not triumphal. It was a muted reconnection, hands finding familiar textures, the smell of fuel and leather hitting like homecoming. I climbed into a flight deck that had nothing to do with the one that had fallen and everything to do with the one that had kept me alive. The engines warmed up and sang in a way that was at once alien and comforting. I liked the habitual motions because they stitched me back. I liked the mundanity of reading instruments and the small ceremonial checks that pilots perform like prayers. People asked whether I feared being in the sky again. I admitted I did. I said, fear is not an enemy, it is a furnace. You can melt it down or let it consume you. For me, fear became a tool to be sharpened and kept near. Training gave me the metal. Life gave me the heat. There were moments later when I went to the crash site, not for the spectacle but for the bones of truth. I walked the field where the plane had come to rest and found the places where the grass had been burned black, like secrets exposed. I ran a hand across metal that had been cut and reshaped by catastrophe and thought of the men and women who had sat within it. I traced gouges and imagined the forces that loved and hated us that day. There were tokens left by townspeople. Flowers, a small stuffed animal at the base of a tree, notes thanking strangers for doing what strangers sometimes do. The families of the dead deserved answers. They deserved more than a public relations line. They deserved accountability. Investigations continued and eventually led to arrests. Individuals in a supply chain whose motives were mercantile and vengeful. I read the papers with a small satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that legal outcomes never restore bones or breathe life back into the chest. Justice, when it arrives, is always proto-humane, an imperfect thing administered by humans who sometimes have more certainty in their suits than they do in their souls. There was also a quieter reckoning. Some of the people I loved thought I had taken an unreasonable risk. They called me reckless in private and sometimes in public. I listened. The charge had a truth to it. Risk had been taken, but others called it sacrifice, and there was truth in that too. The witness of those daily lives saved and those whose names were read in memory created a complicated ledger. I found myself living in that tension. The world had an appetite for tidy stories. They wanted me to be a one-line hero. I was not. I had done something I believed necessary, and I had to live with the consequences, the praise, and the blame. I had to wake up in the middle of the night and hold the memory of the boy close until it warmed me enough to sleep. I had to visit the families of the dead and say the words that fit into grief as best as language allowed. I had to watch strangers preach from newspapers and decide whether to answer them. Mostly, I chose to do the only thing I trusted: keep working. Work is a salve. It is also a test. Returning to the flight line meant dealing with the bureaucracy, the briefings, the new procedures instituted to prevent what happened from happening again. It meant sitting in meetings with technicians and commanders and insisting on thorough audits. There is a temptation to get absorbed in the minutiae of process as a means to avoid the emotional work of being changed by what you did. I tried not to let that happen. I wanted change that mattered. The crew got back together in small ways. Garcia, with a blackened thumbnail and a grin like a crooked flag, sent me an unadorned text that said, in 3 words, everything. Still here, boss. Owens came by, quiet and steadier. We talked about the day in the way of men who had been through a storm and found each other on the other side. We did not make heroes of ourselves. We made mundane jokes about coffee and bad playlists. Those jokes had bones. They helped. Time rearranged things into new normals. There were scars on bodies and scars on policy. There were new boxes in manuals and more cautious hands on certain crates. The base held briefings on chain of custody and oversight and supply verification. There were payoffs and lawsuits and security reviews. People pointed at paperwork as if that would be enough to assuage guilt. It is not. Paperwork is a tool. It is not mercy. Sometimes I wondered if I would have acted differently with my life in a different place. If I had not been a ranger for half my life. If I had not learned to choose quickly and wear consequences like armor. Would I be less culpable? More meek? The answer hovered like a bird. Choices are defined by the people you have been made into. We spend our lives training for certain moments. They arrive, and the training gets to show its face. The boy grew. Men and women from that flight found ways to heal. Some dedicated themselves to telling their stories so that others would know, testaments that would pressure systems to change, to make supply chains safer, to make manifests truthful. There are people who lean into public policy after tragedies because they understand that the private cost can sometimes be translated into public good. I stayed out of the limelight as much as politeness afforded. Interviews dwindled, the novelty waned, as all novelties do. I returned to small, ordinary things, fixing a sink, mowing the yard, laughing at a friend's dumb joke over a beer. There was a humble, blessed ordinariness to it. I liked being unremarkable, the way a soldier likes to be unnoticed in good weather. But invisibility was no longer an option. People had seen me. The world had images of me clenched to a strap with a small hand in mine. The photographs circulated like proof that someone who was usually invisible in daylight could be visible when the world needed it. For people who had never had a voice, that visibility could be a shield. For me, it was neither wholly comfortable nor wholly refused. Years later, long after the investigation files were filed and the hearings had become footnotes, a small ceremony was held on the base. They unveiled a plaque near the training wing, a simple bronze plate with names and dates. I stood among crew members and nurses and families and read the list of people who had been on that manifest. The boy's name was there. He was no longer a child by then, but he still looked at me in a way that made my chest constrict. A mother came up to me afterward and gripped my forearm like she was fastening a strap. Her eyes were wet. "You kept him," she said simply. The sentence held the weight of many days and nights. I felt tears come in the way tears do finally, not as a breaking but as a necessary making. People thanked me, people scolded me. People did not know what to say and said nothing at all. I learned to take what they offered, applause, flowers, anger, with a steadiness I had practiced far from stadium lights, a quiet acceptance that life is not a ledger of perfect returns. There were nights when I walked alone on the tarmac and listened to the hum of planes and let the engine noise reorder the clamoring in my head. In those hours, the Ranger switch that had flipped during the crisis felt less like an on-off and more like an installed module. It lived inside me now in a way that could not be erased. It was useful and dangerous both. It made me decisive, and it made me carry things like others carry suitcases you never unpack. Once at dawn, I climbed again into the flight deck of a C-17, not for a mission but to teach. I ran a quiet simulator session for a group of young pilots and technicians. I watched their faces as we talked about judgment calls and moral calculus and the weight of decisions that don't have nice outcomes. I told them stories without flourishes, offering the meat rather than the legend. I told them that command is the ingestion of consequence, that you'll make choices that no one can applaud and others that no one can forgive, and that you must be ready to bear both. At the end of the class, a young officer came up and asked, Do you ever regret it? I thought of the boy's hand, the photograph in the nurse's palm, the name on the plaque, the man who didn't make it. I thought of the lives saved. I thought of the ways my body still remembered impact in the tiny backache notes that woke me on rainy days. I regret what I lost, I said finally. I don't regret the decision. He nodded, as if that answered the big questions, because sometimes words are placeholders for the truth of absence. I still find myself sometimes standing at the edge of aircraft, feeling the wind as it moves like a live thing across the skin of machines. There is an intimacy to it that is hard to explain, an acknowledgement that these birds carry our fragile lives encoded inside metal and bolt and fuel. They bear us like family in the same way a truck bears furniture. Nobody thanks the truck for being a truck, but everyone is grateful when the sofa arrives whole. They had sabotaged my C-17 in mid-air. They had tried to make the machine betray those inside it. I turned off the power to a thing that could be weaponized and turned on the small, stubborn power inside people to hold each other together. The world noticed for a time. Then it moved on. The people who mattered did not. Garcia swore he would not fly again if I didn't. He lied and came back. Owens bought a motorcycle and nearly killed himself 2 weeks later with a grin. He survived and came back. The nurses wrote me letters that smelled faintly of antiseptic. Families pushed for reforms that bent policy a little closer to common sense. The man who had been pinned beneath the pallet is remembered on a plaque. We survived in the way survivors do, patched, altered, still moving. The cost lingered in the way mountains keep winter. There were nights when I felt small and exposed, and nights when I felt the fierce private pride of a person who had chosen to shield others at a price. I do not pretend there is romanticism about it. Heroism is not a badge without weight. It is a set of consequences stitched to a decision. It is muscle memory made moral and then paid for in quiet ways. I go back to flying because the sky is also where I find the clearest arithmetic of choice. You do the math with the people in the plane, your crew, your passengers, and you act. My hands steady faster than the rest of me. I'm not the only one who can do the work. I am simply willing to do it. When people ask me to tell the story now, I always start the same way, because truth respects the first sentence. They sabotaged my C-17 in mid-air, so I shut down the engines and prepared for the manual crash. The sentence is a hinge. It opens the rest of the thing. After I say it, I tell them the rest, not to boast, but so they know that in the small measure of what we lived, choices have shape and weight. If you are still with me, thank you for listening. If this account moved you, consider subscribing for more stories like this. Real people, hard decisions, the quiet work that keeps the world going. I keep my hands on the controls because some things demand touch. I keep my judgment ready because some things demand thought. I keep my scars and my medals in the same drawer because both belong to the story. And when the world looks at someone invisible and needs them visible, I find I will answer, not for applause, but because someone is asking us to hold them. That, more than anything, is what we are trained to do.